Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's bonus teaching. This week we have me teaching, so no intro. I am the intro. And excited for what I get to share with you guys today, because today we're talking about the concept of rest and Sabbath. To be candid, I was so hesitant. We almost didn't include this bonus teaching. I was so hesitant to talk to a group of coaches, of college coaches, probably the busiest demographic I know, about rest. And I think I was hesitant because I could already picture and totally understand and empathize with the perceived, imagined, right, like eye rolls I would get when talking to a group of college coaches about, like, you need to rest. And I totally would, the immediate like sentiment of like, who has time for that? But so to get it out there, like, I recognize to talk about Sabbath and rest with a group of incredibly responsible and busy people seems counterintuitive. I seriously almost didn't do it. But I do think the position you all are in is so imperative, makes it that much more imperative to seek health. And I think, kind of what the bonus teaching last week, if you got the chance to listen to it, what Rhea and Rachel talked about, this like moral imperative in a position of leadership to seek health. And I think rest is a part of that. Which we'll talk about. So we're going to go for talking about Sabbath here and the idea of Sabbath. And we'll go into, I think if you've grown up in Christian circles or in the church, you've heard the word Sabbath thrown around, but I know until recently, not like the last few years being on staff at FCAV Volleyball, I didn't even know what that actually meant, what the word Sabbath even meant, or what people were referring to when they were talking about Sabbath. And so we're going to talk about what it is, why it's important, and how to actually think about it, and then get into practicals of like, how do you actually even Sabbath? Like, sweet, it's good. What does it look like? So that's where we're headed for this teaching. And to start, I'm going to talk a bit about work actually, though, before we jump into Sabbath, because often in Sabbath, teachings, I've walked away with this belief or feel like shame feeling that to work hard and produce is not nearly as much of a virtue as resting and abiding. That's like the overall sentiment I've walked away from like rest and Sabbath teachings with, I think, growing up. And I just don't think that's true, though. I don't think that rest is any more virtuous than like working hard and producing. I do believe we are meant and built for work and purpose. You guys so get this as coaches, I think. And it goes back to kind of what we talked about at the beginning of this process together, Genesis 1:26 through 28, this like initial invitation God gives to humans of be fruitful, fill the earth and subdue it. We were given the very first interaction, which we talked about, right, going back to that, with God, humans with God, was him giving us a mission and a purpose. Go be fruitful. An invitation to join him in expanding the borders of the garden to all of earth, right? And what I didn't realize for a very long time, and what I want us to notice, is that work was assigned then before the fall. God invited humans into this purpose and this mission before the fall, not as a result of it. We had purpose and mission with God from the beginning. And I used to think that work was maybe this consequence of, oh, we have to work because of the fall. And when we get to heaven, there's never going to be work or mission or purpose. And I don't think that's true, because we see that God invites humans into work and mission and purpose even before the fall happens. And I think that was his intent from the beginning. And again, I think it was not because he needed us to do the work. He could do it on his own, I believe. He's God, but he invites man into it to join him and partner with him because he wants to do it with us. No, he knows, and we've talked about this, but he knows we get to know him more in the process. And so I believe we're meant for work, we're meant for bearing fruit, but it's been warped. The fall, it didn't give us work, but it did warp the way we see it, I think. And it warped it in that it turned work into a production mindset that says we always need to be doing or making more. And I believe it becomes attached to our identities, work. What and how much we do qualifies us for worth, love, belonging, etc. in God's kingdom and family. That's how it's been warped, I think. That's how it's been from the fall. Kind of God's original intent for work has been strayed from. And I think society and sport screams this at us, right? That what you do, what you accomplish, it qualifies you in some sense, whether it qualifies you for worth or belonging or accomplishments or stature, or whatever it is. But I don't think this is ever how God intended it. His system, I believe, what he intended for the relationship of work with human beings, and his order and his kingdom got flipped upside down from what he originally intended. And I actually think God cares deeply about rest because it got flipped upside down. And we see this, though, from the very beginning in Genesis 2:2. And I'm going to share this on the screen so you guys can see it. But in Genesis 2:2, it says, by the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So this is right at creation. God has created heaven and earth and all the animals and human beings and everything. It says, by the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. He rested from all his work. And the reason this is so significant, because this is the same God who blessed Adam and Eve and invited them into fruitfulness just in Genesis 1:26-28. The very next day, he took a day of rest. So he invites humans into purpose and mission and work and fruitfulness, and then the very next day takes a day of rest. And he assigns work, purpose, and mission to humans, but I think if God took the day of rest, and I'm assuming his people did too, who he just created, so the first day of life for Adam and Eve, he makes one of rest. So I think this is so significant because it suggests then that rest is required to bear fruit. That God deeply cares about rest and cares to emphasize his own choice to rest, and thus he desires for us to do so. He desires for us to rest, and he even emphasizes that choice for him to rest immediately after he assigns work and purpose to humans. So we see God cares about rest in this epic moment of like, yes, bear fruit, but first and foremost, before you do that, rest. And I think the reason God cares about rest and why is kind of what we'll get into. And in order to set us up to talk about why God cares about rest, I'm going to go into where we see him first command rest, and that's in the 10 Commandments. And so in Exodus 20, starting in 1, and I'll share my screen again for this, we have God give the 10 Commandments. And I'll read them out, and then I'll kind of get into why they're important, and even why, as much as what they're saying is important, why the order of them is important. So Exodus 20, starting in 1, it says, and God spoke all these words. This is God giving Moses the 10 Commandments to give to the Israelites. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land of the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not cover your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, or his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. So, 10 commandments, which in one form or another we're familiar with, but to give some context, God, with Moses, at this point, when he gives Moses the 10 commandments, has led the Israelites, his chosen people, out of slavery in Egypt. The very first account, which is a huge deal, the very first account of God by human beings here is in an interaction with God as a God of emancipation. So like one of the first interactions with God and his people is his people experiencing God as a God of emancipation. He has freed them from slavery and Pharaoh's system in Egypt. And this system that they were part of in Egypt under Pharaoh's rule, the Israelites, was a system that was brutal. It communicated endless, relentless, persistent, anxious work to prove worth and power. So the Israelites in Egypt during Pharaoh's rule were brick makers. And so that's what they did all day, is they took straw and they packed it and used mortar or whatever they had then to make bricks, to then build things that we know today, like pyramids, in Egypt. And so they were brick makers for a really anxious Pharaoh who relentlessly increased their work over and over to produce more for his kingdom. And so that's the environment they're coming from, is like relentless, never-ending, anxious work and production to prove worth and value of a kingdom that Pharaoh's ruling. And God frees them from this system, right? With Moses and all the plagues and the parting of the Red Sea, God frees the Israelites, he emancipates them from this system, and they end up wandering in the wilderness once they're emancipated, once they're freed. So he gives Moses the 10 commandments as a framework for the people that he's just liberated to operate inside of his new system, God's new system, to shed their lifestyles and habits and worldview from their old system of like slavery and persistent, relentless work, and adopt a new system, which was God's system and kingdom and his order, God's order. So often the 10 commandments are just seen, I know for myself, they were just seen as a list of to-dos and not to-dos, right? But it's so much more about not just do the right thing, and so much more about the God of the universe proclaiming his new order in the world to his people. About the God of the universe proclaiming his new order in the world to his people. It's him saying, this is how things operate in my kingdom, these 10 commandments. So often it's helpful to think less about what the commandments are explicitly saying, and zoom out to think more about what that kind of behavior, that if you follow the 10 commandments, what would that kind of behavior communicate about the kingdom of God and the new order he's establishing with his people? What does it say about God's kingdom that his people shouldn't murder? You know, maybe that every life is valuable. So it's that kind of thing. It's this idea that the 10 commandments were God establishing his kingdom with his people who have just been freed from a an anxious, relentless system. So zoom even further out then, and let's look at the commandments as it regards to rest and Sabbath. So Sabbath comes from the Hebrew word Shabbat and literally means to rest from labor. That's the definition. And in order to zoom out, we need to, and regarding Sabbath, we need to look at the order the commandments are in. This is the whole thing or commentary God is trying to make. The order that he puts the commandments in are super intentional. So the first 3 commandments are put God first, worship God only, don't misuse God's name. So that's 1, 2, and 3. Put God first, worship God only, don't misuse God's name. And they all have to do with how we revere God, our view and relationship and interaction with the divine, personally, right? Us with God. Then you have the Sabbath commandment as the 4th. Keep the Sabbath and even keep it holy, meaning set it apart. That's what holiness means, to set apart. And then the last 6 of the commandments all have to do with how to treat and interact with people. Honor your parents, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't lie, don't covet your neighbor's stuff, all of it, right? So it goes in the order of the commandments, which is really crucial to recognize, is how to treat God, Sabbath, how to treat others. That's the order that they're given in. And this is huge, because what God is saying here, by the way he arranged the commandments to implement his new order and kingdom with his people, is that the very bridge between your relationship with God, translating to how you treat the rest of the world, is rest. That's what Sabbath is, the holding place between how your relationship with God and how you interact with the rest of the world, and the bridge is Sabbath. So more simply, the very bridge and connection between the divine itself and the human experience is rest. The very bridge and connection between the divine itself and the human experience is rest. To connect to the divine and to be fully human, the space in between is rest. So it's a really big deal, right? The way that the commandments are ordered and what God is saying about why he cares about rest. He rested himself. He establishes that in Genesis, but why? And it's because I think what the commandments are suggesting, or he's trying to tell us with the commandments, is this idea that the very bridge between how we connect to God and our relationship with God, translating to how we interact with the rest of the world, is Sabbath and is rest. Okay, so if rest is so important, right, that was like my mic drop for this whole thing, right? And we've just established rest is like crazy important, and I believe God sees it that way. Isn't it funny then that the super important thing that is the bridge between how we interact with God and how we treat others, normally when we think about it, Sabbath, I'll speak for myself, normally when I think about Sabbath and rest, I associate it either with really restrictive boundaries and legalities, like just don't do that. To rest, you cannot do all these things, and that's what rest is. Or I think of it as vacuous rest, which is, watching Netflix, watching sports on a Sunday with friends, napping, etc., just like totally shutting your brain down. And these aren't innately bad things, and for some of them there is totally time and a place, but they aren't, I don't think, they're the fullness of what God intended as rest, nor do they get to the heart of why he emphasized it so much. And I think it's because we lost the why behind rest, that's what we associate with Sabbath, and thus lost vision of how to do it well. So that's what we're going to talk about here, why it's important and how to think about it to do it well. So let's start with why God cares so much about rest. And there's 3 reasons, I think. Number 1 is rest communicates God's relationship with us. Rest communicates God's relationship with us. Rest deconstructs the notion of being qualified for membership in God's family or kingdom. I'm going to say that again because it's a really big deal. Rest deconstructs the notion of being qualified for membership in God's family or kingdom. Rest reminds us that God has chosen us and we are a part of the family before we do anything. And we see him establish this with Jesus. We see this sentiment of what he thinks about his people, and that this is, I believe he believes this about his people, with Jesus in Luke 3:22. When Jesus goes to John the Baptist and he gets baptized, and he comes up from being baptized with John the Baptist, and this is where we pick up in Luke 3:22. It says, "And the Holy Spirit descended on him in bodily form like a dove, and a voice came from heaven, and it said, 'You are my son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased.'" With you I am well pleased. And to note here, right, where we catch up in Jesus's life and his timeline at this moment in Luke 3:22, is that Jesus hasn't done a thing yet. He hasn't started his ministry. He hasn't done any miracles, no teachings. We have that like one moment when he's a teenager in the synagogue, and that's it before this moment. And God says, "This is my son, and with him I am well pleased." And I think what God's trying to communicate here is that he grants us daughter and sonship before we do a thing for him. Before we do a thing for God, he grants us daughtership and sonship. And rest or abiding is a tangible reminder of this daughter and sonship. And then who we are as children of God gives us the permission and invitation to partner with him. We change the world from a place of daughtership or sonship, and rest reminds us of this. Even before our minds can comprehend it fully, maybe, rest reminds us of this tangibly. And so they're like mid-COVID, you know, the like picture of this I have, it was like mid-COVID, and we had a ton of stuff going on with FCA volleyball, and I was on a walk in the morning. I started during quarantine to pick up walking in the morning. I would like wake up for my quiet time and then just start walking and just like do laps around the neighborhood until it felt right to stop. And, you know, during this time, only a couple months ago, I had a ton of stuff going on. And particularly in this day that I was in, I remember waking up to walk and I had a ton of stuff going on specifically that day. And I woke up for the walk I was going to take and literally set out thinking, what is the point of walking? Like, this is just like, walking to me communicates, you have time. But so I begin my walk thinking like, dang, this is just like such a waste of time. I have so much to do today. I have so many things to accomplish. And here I am walking. But as I got further into it, it forced me to slow down. And it forced me to observe little details, to focus what was right in front of me. Like, wow, look at those tiger lilies. I had no idea that house was even here. Has this tree always been here? Right? Like, that's kind of what started to happen as I like started to walk, and it literally physically forced me to slow down. So that by the end of it, I felt my thoughts slow down. I felt my pace slow down. I was thankful for the little things. I like stood in my driveway at the end of it for 5 more minutes, just admiring the flowers, and the smell of the air in the morning here in Huntington is just like amazing. And the sun on my face. And I was able to receive the message that I was enough right there. Like I heard God say, right, like deep in my soul, I am enough right here. And I wouldn't have got there unless my physical actions and decisions had led my mind to catch up to that reminder that before I did anything that day, I was enough standing in the driveway with the sun shining on my face. And so I think rest communicates to us then tangibly that we don't have to do a thing to earn God's attention. favor, to earn his favor, to earn his belonging in his family. That's not how he operates. And rest is the tangible reminder of that. So the first reason I think God cares about rest so much is because it communicates his relationship with us. Number 2, rest communicates our relationship with our neighbor. Rest communicates our relationship with our neighbor. To talk about this, I'm going to go to Luke 14, 15 to 24, and I'll put it up on the screen again here for everyone, and go into this is a parable of the great banquet. So starting at 15, the parable of the great banquet. When one of those at the table with him heard this, he said to Jesus, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." Jesus replied, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, 'I have just bought a field and I must go and see it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I have just bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me.' Still another said, 'I just got married, so I can't come.' The servant came back and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, 'Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.' 'Sir,' the servant said, 'what you ordered has been done, but there is still room.' Then the master told his servant, 'Go out to the roads and country lanes and compel them to come in, so that my house will be full. I tell you, not one of those who were invited will get a taste of my banquet.'" And so Jesus is speaking here. He gives this parable. And again, to give some background, the idea of a banquet during the time that Jesus was alive and him using this parable, these were for the big rollers, banquets were. Banquets were things reserved for people who had money and excess, right? They were lavish. You had to have money to spend and food to share if you were throwing a banquet. And typically, it was a status thing. Who showed up to your banquet indicated your own status in society. So you invited successful, wealthy people to reflect on your reputation. Banquets were for those who produced, who made enough money to throw them in the first place. So banquets were for those who produced. But in this parable, and this isn't even the point, but all the people invited are too busy with their producing to show up. So the people that the person throwing the banquet invites are too busy with their producing to even show up to the banquet. So the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame get invited instead. Those who explicitly are not producing or are unable to produce in the first place, they're the ones invited to the banquet in Jesus' parable. Jesus is saying production does not elicit invitation to the table in this kingdom. The poor and powerless and the destitute and those explicitly unable to produce actually are the ones who have an invitation to the banquet in this parable. So imagine you're in Jesus's social context and you hear this parable. How does this change your view on what makes a person valuable or worthy? Jesus is essentially saying here, another human being's ability to produce is completely irrelevant to their value. They are valuable because they are. End of story. It's innate. They're born with it. So to rest and to see your neighbor rest is to communicate to yourself that my neighbor's value does not come from their production. Another person's value does not come from their production. Just as my invitation to the banquet table does not come from what I do, neither does theirs. And if this was true, if this is the lens we are seeing the world through, and this is what rest consistently communicated to us, how would you interact with people differently if this is how you saw everyone? That just as my invitation is not based on what I do, so are other people's. Their invitations are not based on their production value. And so I think that's the second reason God cares about rest so much, is because rest communicates our relationship with our neighbor, which is to say that other people's production does not determine their worth or value. And finally, number 3, rest communicates our relationship with ourselves. So the first one, rest communicates our relationship with God. The second one, rest communicates our relationship as God intended with our neighbors. And number 3, rest communicates our intended relationship with ourselves. Here's the kicker. Christians do an excellent job of thinking about their relationship with God. And I would even venture to say we do a really good job of thinking about how that relationship should affect our relationship with others. You know what we rarely do? Think about how our relationship with God should affect our relationship with ourselves. But letting rest affect how we see ourselves is crucial to letting our experience with the divine affect the human experience, with letting our relationship with God affect how we interact with the rest of the world, which is kind of the whole point of being Christian, isn't it? Right? To let our relationship with God affect how we interact with the rest of the world. And so back to Exodus 20 and the 10 Commandments, the way we interact with God affects how we interact with others hinges on the idea of rest. And I think it's because when you are at rest with yourself, how much more likely are you able to be at rest with others? When you are at rest with yourself, how much more likely are you able to be at rest with others? Because think about what rest communicates to us about ourselves. Rest is a tangible reminder to ourselves that we are enough, that we have enough. If we're spending a day not trying to move forward in production, it's subconsciously communicating that what we have today is enough and that we are doing enough, that the world can go on without us producing, that our work 6 other days of the week will suffice and we can afford to not work for one. So if you believe those 3 things about yourself, that you are enough, that you have enough, and that you're doing enough, do you think you'll covet? Right? Do you think you'll steal? Do you think you'll disrespect or need to protect in order to validate? Do you think you'd lie to preserve or protect? If you saw yourself as innately valuable, how much easier would it be to see others that way? If that was true, do you think you would murder? Right? The other 10 commandments, like if you saw yourself that you were enough, you had enough, and you were doing enough, how much easier is it then to uphold the rest of the 10 commandments and interact with the world in a way that says my relationship with God is influencing how I interact with the rest of the world. So the narrative you tell yourself is the narrative you'll put out into the world. And I think God knows this. So if you believe God is at rest with you and you're at rest with yourself, then you'll communicate that rest to others. So I think God really cares about rest. It can be summed up with those 3 reasons: that number 1, rest communicates God's relationship with us. Number 2, rest communicates our relationship with our neighbor. And number 3, rest communicates our relationship with ourselves. Okay, so now to wrap up, if we buy into that why behind rest and Sabbath, that it communicates those 3 things, how do we actually think about doing it? And then where does work come in? So first, in how to think about rest, that's what we'll talk about first. There are 2 categories of rest. Number 1 is vacuous rest. And this is, I referred to earlier, but this is just totally unplugging. Not thinking, decompressing, turning your brain off, vegging out, whatever you want to call it. There's absolutely a time and place for this. It is good and necessary. But when you talk about Sabbath rest, what I think God was referring to was what is called generative rest. So that rest that takes you somewhere, moves you forward, or deeper in your interaction with or understanding of God, self, and others. And rather than saying what is vacuous versus generative rest, because I think that can look different for everyone, instead, I want to give you guys a framework to think about what would be generative rest for you specifically, and by asking yourself the following questions. So we'll post these questions, we'll send them in the email for you guys, but some of the questions to ask and what would be generative rest for you is, how do I feel the most connected to God? How do I process thoughts best? Where do I feel the most at peace or alive? Where and with who do I feel the most present? What do I want to do? What feels creative to me? What boundaries do I need to set to have the space to rest? Technology, time, people, noise, distraction. What is okay and what is not okay with those boundaries? And then once you kind of fill those out and think about what would generative rest look like to me, what's the place, what's the setting, questions to ask yourself once you're there could be, what stood out to me this week? Why? What are you trying to say to me, God? What went well this week and where did I see God? What am I proud of myself for? What was hard this week? Why? What does God have to say about it? How am I feeling after this week? Why? What are you saying, God? Even doing a brain dump and just writing every thought that comes to your mind in your journal and then recognizing and identifying themes. And then asking the question, what am I learning this week? What do I think God is asking me to step into right now? And so we'll post those questions, but to start to think about what does generative rest actually look like for me, that's kind of where you can start when you're thinking about your Sabbath, like what could my Sabbath practice actually look like? And for you guys to know, this can take time. It's a learning game. We're not used to this concept as a society. So if you walk away from trying to rest for your first year even, like you set aside your time, you put it on the calendar, and you walk away every single time frustrated, for the first year, that's expected. And so for you to give yourself permission to experiment here, to really try things out, to let it look different, to learn about yourself in this process even and how you connect to God, is the freedom I want to give you guys. But some examples of what it could look like, and could be as simple as going to a coffee shop and journaling, hiking, going to the beach and doing a body scan of like how you're feeling and your emotions, and then reading after. Lighting candles in your room and playing music and painting. Creativity is a huge expression of rest. Worshiping, playing music, singing, going on a road trip, taking yourself out to breakfast, going to breakfast with a loved one, and processing what you learned that week together. It can be anything, really, and it's totally dependent on who you are and how God's created you. But the whole point is intentionality. Are you intentionally connecting and recharging from your week with God? So last thought with how, this is a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly rhythm thing. You see Jesus operate this way, that his rest had daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly rhythms. So yes, when I talk about Sabbath, usually, and I think it is great to set a whole day apart for rest with God, and to put it on your calendar, because you do what's on your calendar, right? So to set a whole day apart to rest with God is, yes, the idea of Sabbath, but also if we can do things within each day to come from rest, to work from rest, I believe that's how we're supposed to operate and work. So Sabbath, the idea of Sabbath can be a daily, monthly, yearly practice. And so I'll end with kind of a story that I think is the best experience I've had with like really what Sabbath can look like in your life. And I think the picture of Sabbath that God desires. And then, yeah, leave you guys with some closing thoughts. But the best experience I've had with what Sabbath really can look like was after my sophomore year of college. My dad had just taken a job in Chicago, and he was living there in the city to hit the job, while my mom and sisters, my two younger sisters, stayed in Spokane, where I'm from, for my sisters to finish up high school for the year. So there's 6 weeks between when my dad had already moved to Chicago and my mom and sisters had to stay in Washington in order to finish up school. And I had already been done with college and finished my semester, and had the option to either go home to Spokane or to go spend that time with my dad in Chicago and help him look at different neighborhoods that we wanted to move into because we hadn't found a house yet, and explore the city and kind of help him land on where we were going to live there. And I decided I'd had a really hard year that year. It's my sophomore year. I was a starter on our team. All the captains were graduating. I felt a deep sense of responsibility and leadership on the team at the time. I'd had a ton of injuries. I'd had a really stressful school year, and I was just so tired. I just remember leaving school just thinking, getting on the plane thinking, I am just so like mind, body, spirit tired. And so I made the decision, and me and my dad, so some background, are super close, like very much similar. He's one of my best friends. And at this point, my sophomore year, as I was finishing up my semester, I hadn't seen him in like 9 months. So there'd just been like a gap in us being able to see each other since Christmas. And I had just hadn't seen him for a super long time. And so I decided and had this like deep feeling of like, I just need to be with my dad. Like all I want after this year, after this semester, is just to be with my dad. So I decided to go to Chicago for the 6 weeks before we flew back to help my mom and sisters move everything out and be with him and help him find a house for where we're going to live when everyone moved out to the Midwest. So what it looked like is we didn't have a car at the time. And so we just took MTA, or maybe that's New York, forgive me. We just took commuter trains out to the different suburbs that we were thinking about living in, and would get off the train to the high school that we were trying to research and look at and get a feel for that community. And we had identified the high schools that were really good in the area and just for my sisters to go to, and went to that area and just got off the train and just walked the neighborhoods. And we're essentially kind of prayer walking, I guess, now that I look at it. Just like, hey, how does this feel? What do we think about this? Do we like this? How far is it from the city? How far is it from work? Who are the people we see? What does this have to offer? And that was like our entire weekends for 6 weeks. And even sometimes after work with my dad, we would just walk the suburbs of Chicago. I have this really acute knowledge of the suburbs of Chicago because of this experience. And we just get to, while we were walking, we're like observing to see if this is somewhere we want to live. But more than that, it was just this time to let me be with my dad and rest with him. And we'd sit on trains and walk around these neighborhoods, and he just listened to me debrief the last year I just had. And we'd walk around together, and I just got to be his daughter again. That's what this 6 weeks was. I just got to be a daughter again. Not a captain, not a starter, not a student, not a leader, not a roommate, not a girlfriend at the time, just a daughter. And it was him expecting nothing from me for 6 weeks in the summer, just walking around neighborhoods, but just to delight in who I was and spend time with me. Like that was his expectation. And it was the most refreshing time of my life to just be a daughter with my dad for 6 weeks. And I think this is the point of Sabbath, to just show up and get to be in this space with God where you are nothing but a daughter or a son. You're not a coach, you're not a parent, you're not a spouse or a significant other, you're not a leader, you're not an athletic director. You are just a son or daughter getting to spend time with your dad, and the ways in which how refreshing that is, and the ways in which you see God, yourself, and others from that place is so, so important. So my final thought for you guys is, what would it look like to spend a day or even 2 hours in a week, concentrated time, to put it on your calendar, simply sitting with God to have him remind you, no matter what your record is or the pressure or responsibility you feel, that is all gone, because you do not need to be qualified to be a part of God's kingdom. How would that change how you see yourself? How would it change your leadership? How would it change how you interact with the world? So I believe this is something that, we have permission to step into. And I would encourage you to just go for it. Try it. Let it be hard a couple times. Let it feel awkward or weird and maybe even just like suck. But see what ways God might show up too. So let me pray for you guys, and then, hope that this teaching is refreshing and something you guys can use. So, God, thank you for the ways you invite us into rest. Thank you for the ways you invite us to just be, for the ways that we don't have to be qualified to be in your kingdom, for the ways that you already are well pleased with us. Just as we are enough. We are doing enough. So we just get to be with you. Would you let the idea that we do not have to be qualified to be in your kingdom or to have value on this earth inform how we see ourselves, how we see you, how we interact with you, and how we interact with the world, how we interact with our teams and our people on a daily basis. And ultimately, God, would you continue to inform our identity and what you think about us through the tangible practice of rest? Would you give these coaches the time and the space to, get creative with this, to get creative with how they interact with you, and to ultimately be reminded that they, first and foremost, are your son or daughter, and that you are well pleased with them. So we thank you and we love you. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.